My name is Deborah Capel, and on behalf of the board of the Princeton Adult School, I'd like to welcome you to this fifth lecture in our Globalization series, in which we are pursuing the endless flow of people, goods, and ideas. I'm here to introduce you to Professor John Eikenberry, who's the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University in the Department of Politics and at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Professor Eikenberry received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1985. Since then, he's taught at Georgetown University and the University of Pennsylvania, and held posts at the State Department and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's the author of After Victory, Institutions, Strategic Restraint, and the Rebuilding of Order After Major Wars, Princeton University Press, 2001, which won the 2002 Schroeder-Jervis Award presented by the American Political Science Association for the best book in international history and politics. He's currently working on a book entitled Liberal Leviathan, The Origins, Crisis, and Transformation of the American System, which is forthcoming, I guess, again from Princeton University Press. He's a collection of his essays entitled Liberal Order and Imperial Ambition, American Power and International Order, will be published next year by Polity Press. He's also the author and editor of many, many books and articles, too numerous for me to mention here. But in any case, we're thrilled to have Professor Eikenberry with us tonight to speak on international security, the dilemmas of American power in an age of globalization. So please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Great to be here. I guess you can hear me. Maybe not. Hello? Thank you. Good to be here. It's a great series. We've got some people that you've heard already and you're going to have coming to visit in the next few weeks, and I'm glad to be a part of that series. My focus really will be on American power and international security in the age of globalization, and obviously this is something that is kind of unfolding before our very eyes. Just the election a week ago has added yet another moment of drama in this unfolding story of how the United States in the post-9/11 world decides how it wants to interact with the outside world, and how the outside world is changing and creating different demands and constraints on the U.S. So big issues are on the table tonight, and I would just start with some observations. And the first observation is that the American global position in the world is troubled. The Iraq War has gone badly. In 2003, the worst post-war crisis in U.S.-European relations occurred. The Bush administration, in the background, has pursued a unilateral foreign policy with very dramatic and controversial security doctrine associated with regime change. Iraq itself was kind of the emblematic part of that strategy. And big debates have been triggered over the last 5 years. Debates about alliances, multilateralism, the United Nations, legitimacy of U.S. power. Also in the background, Bush himself, not terribly popular in Europe. His public opinion rating in America is hovering around 30%. In fact, in the last few years, the only thing Europe and the United States could really agree on is they both don't like Bush very much. Kind of odd. But we'll see. Things may be changing. But it is possible to step back and look at the last few years and suggest that perhaps we are at a historical turning point. Maybe not unlike the 1940s, when basic questions of how the United States and the global system are to connect to each other. Basic questions about who benefits, who commands, who runs the show, who rules the game. Henry Kissinger argued some time ago that he has not seen the global system in such a state of flux in his life, with so few rules and norms and institutions that are agreed upon to guide the flow of change. As a result, people are asking a variety of questions, big questions. One of them, I think, is the question of whether the United States has made some kind of fundamental turn away from its post-war liberal international multilateral leadership position? If so, if there's been a turn from something that existed over the earlier 50, 60 years, how deep a turn is it? Is it really about Bush, Iraq, neocons, and therefore will sort of go away at some point? It's more episodic, it's more circumstantial. Or is America's changing position in the world more structurally being driven? That is to say, is it driven by something that has to do with change in America or change in the world? So that's the first big question. Is there something fundamental shifting America in its international posture? The second question is, what would be the agenda for renewal if there were to be a kind of new foreign policy? This is the debate on what comes next. If the Democrats win, or McCain, if a different political leader with a different set of ideas came to power, what would be that agenda? And I want to say a little bit about both those things tonight, both about the forces that are shifting and shaping American policy, and a little bit at the very end about the future. And on that second point about agenda for the future, you'll hear more from Dean Anne-Marie Slaughter later on in this series, but she and I have, this is a point of advertising now, just like I was waving the book, a new report called the Princeton Project on National Security, which tries to lay out a vision of American national security in the 21st century. And at the very end, if I have time, I'll say a few things about that, but I have a feeling she'll talk about it as well. So in the next 40 minutes or so, let me say something about the old order, about the crisis of the old order, then say something about why we're at this historical turning point, the big forces at work, including globalization, and then say something about ideas about the future. So I'll say something about the past, the present, and the future. And I would start really by saying something about the crisis. And it is quite amazing, lurking in the background, this post-war system that I'm going to talk about in a moment has come into a moment of crisis. Think about it. It's amazing. All the major post-war international institutions are in trouble in one way or another, or certainly weakened. Let's list them. The United Nations. September of last year, there was a big reform conference in New York. The agenda for renewal of the United Nations was put on the table, and it didn't go anywhere. The Security Council wasn't reformed. New rules were put forward about how to use force in the wake of Iraq. They didn't pass muster either. It was a disappointment. The United Nations moment came, and it didn't stand up and reform itself. And there's a complex story there, of course. But the United Nations has come into a moment of crisis. Scandals in the background as well. The European Union, the Constitution failed, and this certainly closes off a pathway for Europe into the future that would entail a strong Europe at the international level, providing either partnership with the United States or balancing or disciplining from a kind of offshore position of the United States, but a strong Europe able to stand up and help provide global governance certainly is off the table as well, even though Europe is doing lots of good things, including peacekeeping. There are 90,000 European troops in various trouble spots around the world. So it's not an entirely negative story, but Europe as a global leader is not something we can anticipate. NATO, the backbone of the West, the most important security institution in history, it too is in crisis. It's no longer the seat of security dialogue between Europe and the United States. You certainly have had new members join NATO from the East who eagerly wanted to be part of this Western security club, and it's sort of like they've come to a party and the original sponsors are gone. There's empty plates and there are drinks around, but the actual partiers are now gone. So they've arrived at the party and no one there. The door's open. A few people are passed out on the couch, but it's not the NATO of old. What happened? The IMF and World Bank, they too have, in effect, come to identity crisis. They don't know what really to do. Their missions, their post-war missions of monetary and aid have come into question. The IMF doesn't really do what it used to do, so they are searching for their own missions. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, probably the most successful international organization up and running today, it too is having problems. The Doha round, which was to provide liberalization of agriculture that would have provided benefits for developing countries. It's the development round, finally a chance for the rules to be accommodative to development and to third world countries. It has stalled for all sorts of reasons. So it too is not at a very peak moment. So all these institutions simultaneously are in trouble. And then the United States, standing behind these institutions, that it has been the global champion for all these years, it too looks like its willingness to provide multilateral global leadership is more uncertain. The U.S. in the last years, it's really started in the Clinton administration, has said no to a whole host of international treaties. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, the Kyoto Protocol on global warming, a whole host of arms control agreements, light weapons ban, landmines, not going forward with the comprehensive test ban, a kind of rejection of this long-standing approach to international security associated with arms control, disarmament, treaties that lead parties to simultaneously step back from the brink. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the most successful treaty after the UN, the most subscribed to, over 160 countries are members of it, forswearing the accumulation of nuclear weapons and material. That treaty is in crisis, many people believe, and the United States has not been terribly eager to provide leadership. The Secretary of State did not go to New York last year for the 5-year review of that treaty, which provides mechanisms for again, negotiating the reduction of nuclear weapons and providing bargains between the permanent nuclear powers and the non-nuclear powers to each have responsibilities that keep the system from proliferating. So the crisis of the old order is upon us, manifest in the weakening of the institutions that have for 50 years provided the kind of support structure for peace and security. The very core institutions are in trouble. Cooperative security, NATO, the UN, open trade, the WTO, international governance of global problems, not finding new mechanisms for global warming and for mechanisms for managing globalization. So we're in a moment where there's great uncertainty where we're going to go. Where will the leadership be provided? Will we have governance of the global system as we've had in the past? So I want to talk a little bit about this old order and a little bit about why it's in crisis and what we might anticipate in the future. So past, present, and future. Let me start with some historical arguments to try to put where we are in context and make 3 arguments. One is an argument about the American approach to building international order, which has been exhibited for the last 60 years. The U.S. has, in effect, provided leadership to the world since 1945 by providing or pursuing 2 types of strategies. One is a traditional realist strategy associated with people like Henry Kissinger. It's power politics. It was developed really after World War II to deal with the Soviet challenge and communism. So a realist strategy, a balance of power against the Soviet Union and containment of Soviet communism, ideological rivalry. And this realist strategy of containing the Soviet Union, George Kennan, Princetonian, who was the architect really of the idea of containment, just passed away at 100 years old in 2004. This strategy of balance, bipolarity, deterrence, ideological rivalry yielded a bounty of institutions. NATO, the U.S.-Japan alliance, the U.S.-Korean alliance, wider security arrangements, providing a cooperative security net over almost all of the free world, creating and provisioning security for the West and parts of Asia during the Cold War. This was the American Security Order, and it is what really ended with the Cold War. And it was it's still with us in specific security relationships. As Chalmers-Johnson, one scholar, has counted, the U.S. has bases in over 50 countries still. The United States has 123 golf courses that the Pentagon does around the world on bases all over the world. There's a kind of informal system of American security protection that is, in some sense, the legacy of this Cold War realist project. It's with us today. The other strategy the U.S. pursued after World War II is less well known, less famous. It doesn't have an icon like Kennan attached to it, and it's what I would call a liberal grand strategy. And it was built, it has built order and has anticipated it and desire. It's pursuing the establishment of order, I guess that's the way to say it, by pursuing specific objectives such as economic openness, establishing the rule of law, joint management of global problems, multilateral rule institutions, democracy promotion, cooperative security. So there's this second strategy. During the Cold War, in the shadow of the Cold War, building trade institutions, promoting cooperation among democracies. This is the Western project associated with the Atlantic Charter of Roosevelt and Churchill in 1941, the Bretton Woods Accords of 1944, even the Marshall Plan, getting Europe on its feet, as one American diplomat said, getting Europe on its feet and off our backs. Building strength in other parts of the democratic world so there's a broader, deeper, stronger free world system. After the Cold War, both political parties embraced this liberal grand strategy. I spent a year at the State Department in the last year of Bush the Elder's administration, 1991-92, went on sabbatical from Princeton, and it was actually the last year of the Cold War, the last year of the Bush administration. Right, if you may recall, Gorbachev went on holiday, and there was a coup in Moscow, and there was, it was all covered on CNN, and the tanks in front of the Parliament building, and a young, charismatic politician, Boris Yeltsin, got up on a tank, put his fist in the air, baritone voice, really calling for the coup to end, and it did. Democracy of some sort was put forward, but the Federation collapsed and the Cold War ended. And I was in the State Department at that moment. It was a weird moment because all these diplomats had for so many years been pursuing containment. And now their job in some sense was done. What do we do now? And so it was kind of an existential moment, and also a moment of well, what's going to keep the system together? Because for all these years, the system has been held together by the West, banding together because of the Soviet threat. Soviet threat's gone. What holds us together? And interestingly, George Sr. Came forward with ideas that had to do with values and common values of democracy and capitalism that bound the West together. We used the term Euro-Atlantic community, and George Bush Sr. Gave speeches about this. So did Jim Baker, who apparently is back in Washington. But the idea was to keep the system open and stable by promoting markets and democracy and institutional cooperation that is deeply embedded in democratic society. So you had Euro-Atlantic community, you had NAFTA, you had APEC in Asia, building institutions of joint cooperation. Clinton came to power, loved liberal grand strategy. He had a much more grandiose vision in enlargement, expansion, engagement, and he and his advisors wrote and gave fancy speeches with big words that suggested this as well. And then Bush too. Bush the younger has, in his foreign policy, has aspects of this liberal grand strategy. Doha trade round, China policy, the hemispheric trade plan for the Western Hemisphere. All of these are liberal strategies of order building. So realist strategies, liberal strategies worked together during the Cold War. Liberal strategy survived the end of the Cold War, bipartisan in both parties, deeply rooted in American ideas about politics and economics. Just as an aside, in the late Clinton years, I wrote an op-ed for the LA Times saying, there's a liberal grand strategy. We aren't lost after the Cold War. We know what we're doing. America has a vision. We've got great ideas. So I wrote a piece in the Sunday LA Times, 1 million circulation at that time, and we've got an idea. We aren't lost on the sea without a compass. I got one letter. It was from the Clinton White House, and it was from the National Security Advisor who said, "Thank you, Professor Eichenberry. We didn't know we had a strategy." So here it is. They apparently tacked it up on the water cooler, and they could kind of, we're strategists too, We're not just democratic hacks who are trying to, we're strategists, we can go toe-to-toe with Henry Kissinger. Well, there was a strategy in the kind of full sense of impulses coming out of America. Now, these strategies have built an order. This is the old order we're talking about, an order that it was quite remarkable, like nothing the world has seen before, from 1945 to today. An order, it's not a global order, but it crosses the Atlantic, the Pacific. It ties the democracies together. It's certainly based on common values and institutions of capitalism and democracy. But it's also an engineered order. It's built on bargains. And two bargains, I think in particular, a realist bargain. Growing out of the Cold War, the U.S. in this bargain will provide security for Europe and Asian allies, and in return, these Asian allies will support America, bandwagon with the United States, provide diplomatic and logistical and economic assistance in the context of a jointly operated international system. The U.S. would provide security, access to its markets, technology, and supplies in the context of an open world economy. So one strategy or one bargain was of the security sort. The other bargain was a political bargain that had more to do with how countries would deal with a powerful America. And this was the bargain where, in effect, the United States would bind itself to its allies, would build institutions where American power would be put together with allies, and we would deliberate and jointly plan and work together, not always, but in a way that made America more an attractive great power that countries would want to work with. If Bill Gates were here, he'd say, "Oh, I know what you mean. Make America user-friendly. You can kind of plug into America." And so the United States, in effect, in this bargain, U.S. power would, in effect, be made safe for the world, and the world would join America in this jointly led order. So the final point about the post-war order is that it was fabulously successful. It created, I would argue, the most successful international order in history, measured in terms of wealth creation and physical security. Nothing has ever been engineered in history that has been as successful as this American-led order. Built with these institutions, open trade, permanent institutions for doing business, a political bargain, a social bargain at home, so that countries that were part of this open world economy would have safety nets and mechanisms that would compensate for the instability that open markets brings. And finally, this old order was built on cooperative security. Countries were tied together through these alliances in really new ways. And so countries, Europe and the United States, and then Japan and Korea, were tied together. We were part of the same system. The American soldiers were committed to fight and die for the security of Europeans and Asians. Europeans and Asians saw that their fate was tied to America's fate. And political institutions that made doing business each way across the Atlantic and the Pacific something that was mutually beneficial, predictable. Everybody got a say. Power was not equal, but there was a sense in which the U.S. would provide public goods, would be a good leader, would listen, and other countries would say, you know, we'd rather spend time cooperating with you rather than resisting you, running around you, trying to form alternative orders. So that's the old order. And I spent a lot of time after Victory, this book that Deborah very kindly mentioned, talks a lot about that and the logic of the American system, the kind of the brilliance of the American vision of how to do order. And it's an order, as I suggested, that is built on both kind of realist, hard-nosed kind of calculations and what we'll call political liberal calculations of how you get countries to want to work with you. Hard power, soft power. So there you have it. That's the old order. But it's in crisis, as I suggested, measured in terms of the institutions have weakened, America's own commitment to leadership looks uncertain, America's position in the order. Fewer countries see themselves as tied to the United States, as, if you will, see the American project, however you want to talk about it today, and the global project as the same thing. Anti-Americanism is prevalent and rampant, really, around the world. American credibility, prestige is at an all-time low. Political pundits from left and right and center have all talked about a legitimacy crisis. I would call it a kind of crisis of authority. The United States, because of the old order, the authority was partly a kind of collective authority that centered on Washington and was built around alliances and multilateral institutions and all the rest. Somehow that's eroded, and that there's a kind of authority crisis. No one sort of speaks for the global system. There doesn't seem to be a single project. The ideas that America have don't seem to be ideas that travel so well anymore. So the crisis is there. What's going on here? Is this just about, you know, a Crawford, Texas strategy that has come athwart the wishes of the global system, or is there something deeper going on that has made America and its global partners put those relationships in trouble? I think there are deeper sources, and this is where I would say beware John McCain or Hillary Clinton or anybody else who wants to take over the reins of government and do foreign policy. There are deeper problems that have created this impasse. I'll mention 4 of them. The one is the most obvious, the end of the Cold War. I tended to belittle this issue, even though I was there at the moment in the State Department, as a kind of world-changing event, because the United States did keep doing things. It kept using its liberal strategy that was used during the Cold War, after the Cold War. So in many ways, the liberal strategy survived, and the order that was used to build was still there. Countries were joining it. In some ways, that was what the end of the Cold War was all about. People globbing on to this order that had been built in the shadow of the Cold War. But the end of the Cold War made a difference. It ended, of course, as I suggested earlier with the anecdote about the State Department in August 91, it ended the common threat that did have a kind of glue-producing effect on alliances and on cooperation. I remember one of my State Department colleagues are running down the hallway saying, "Where's the glue that's going to hold us together?" Well, the end of the Cold War was glue. I've tried to argue that America, liberal America, is kind of a big glue factory, but it's not as producing as much as it used to. The end of the Cold War is part of the problem. The implications are that it raises basic questions. Why remain inside alliances? How should we think about threats? Because there are still threats, but we don't agree on them as much. Identity questions, deeper questions. Who are we? Are we a we anymore? The end of we-ness, as one of my colleagues says. What is the West? Is there still a free world that has some kind of privileged set of relationships? So the end of the Cold War has thrown a lot of things into question. I want to focus on 2 other sources of erosion of order, however. And the next one is the rise of U.S. unipolarity. And unipolarity is the most kind of jargony term I'm going to use this evening. But it's used to describe the fact that we live in a one superpower world defined in terms of military power, hard political power in particular. It's interesting. After the Cold War, 91 and after, people thought the world was going to be multipolar. There would be Europe, and there would be Asia, the US, certainly 3 poles. Maybe the former Soviet Union would be a 4th. But it would be multipolar, kind of evenly divided power centers around the world. Well, that didn't happen. From 1990, 1998, the U.S. entered the, if you will, the post-Cold War era as the only superpower, and it had a better decade than any of the other states. Between 1990 and 1998, the U.S. grew 27%, Europe 16%, and Japan 7%. They actually did grow. I go to Japan a lot. They didn't see much growth during those years, but they did grow, but not as much as the United States. The U.S. really had a slam-bang decade, and so now it reduced military spending at a lower level, but because of its GNP growth, it could continue to produce military power at a fairly low cost, below the Cold War level. And so today, the U.S., and this is amazing, spends half the world's expenditures of military capability. The U.S. spends as much as the rest of the world combined. 4% of the world's population, 50% of the world's military spending. 85% of the world's spending on military R&D, the kind of the drones and the high-tech this and that, 85%. So this advantage may last for a long time, and there are some, not just the neocons, but a lot of the techie folks in the Pentagon and around the Pentagon, and even people like Newt Gingrich have ideas about what they call breakout strategies, spending things in certain areas so that no one will ever catch up. It's a kind of structural leap into world primacy. Paul Wolfowitz loves that kind of stuff, lots of others. U.S. dollar is the global currency, bases, as I suggested, and golf courses all over the world. The U.S. is a global power. People have stopped trying to compare the United States to Britain, which was, in the old days, it was Britain and the Pax Britannica, the Pax Americana. But now, even Britain looks, kind of puny. The U.S. is 80, 90% larger than its nearest party, next largest economy. During the heyday of British hegemony, British dominance, it was about 12% larger than its nearest rival. So the U.S. is almost an order of magnitude larger than any competitor if you don't aggregate Europe, Germany, France, Britain. Russia has an economy the size of Denmark. Japan has about half the GNP of the United States, but has a dwindling population and has a constitutional prohibition on this kind of military power. So the United States really is, China is a developing country, is a unipolar state in meaningful ways. What are the implications? It's easier for the United States to say no. Secondly, it's easier for other countries to say, hey, we'll free ride on the United States. We'll let them do it. And by the way, the greatest political strategy is to let them do it and then complain about it. You get points at home and you don't have to spend money doing this or that to help provide security or do things. It certainly means that with these power shifts there will be a renegotiation of bargains. The old bargains, 50, 60-year-old bargains, are on the table. But I think there's a subtle shift that I'm trying to work out in this new book called Liberal Leviathan that I'm writing about how the end of bipolarity and the end of multipolarity has had an effect. In bipolarity, and during the bipolar Cold War, bipolar means two superpowers kind of balancing each other, U.S. authority came from leading a coalition of states in balancing against threatening states. Fair enough. Under unipolarity, this logic of rule disappears. This is new and different and potentially threatening to weaker and smaller states. As a result, the power of the United States is thrown into the full light of day. Unipolarity itself becomes a quote-unquote problem in world politics. As John Gaddis, my friend at Yale, a diplomatic historian, writes, American power during the Cold War was acceptable to other states because there was something worse over the horizon. With the end of bipolarity and with the rise of unipolarity, that something worse has disappeared. So there's a subtle shift in authority that America has. It was almost automatically generated when the U.S. was providing this balancing service. Now that's gone. Now, why should the United States be so powerful and important? Why should it have authority? What are the basis of its authority other than hard military power? So there's that problem. The erosion, the third shift I've mentioned into the Cold War, unipolarity. Now the third one, erosion of Westphalian sovereignty. This is an important one, not as obvious. It's a quiet transformation of the global system. It's the human rights revolution, and in the resulting erosion of norms that states have privileges and rights to what they do inside of their own boundaries. The international community, in other words, increasingly is seen to have legitimate interest in what goes on within countries. Eleanor Roosevelt, remember the Universal Declaration on Human Rights? Individuals within countries have rights that are not simply secured by their own government, but the international community has some say in what goes on. Governments can't abuse their own people. Sovereignty is contingent. Two implications of this. Eroded norms of sovereignty have created new license for powerful states to intervene in domestic affairs of weak and troubled states. The norm of sovereignty has less stopping power, if you will, fewer inhibitions on intervention. And secondly, eroded sovereignty has not been matched by the rise of new norms and agreements on how to intervene. Who speaks for the international community? The international community now has things to say about what goes on: genocide, massive or systematic abuse of human rights, hosting terrorists on your land. Lots of reasons why the international community cares about what goes on inside of states, more so than ever before. It's been a quiet revolution. But who speaks for the international community that has this new interest? As a result, the erosion of norms of sovereignty have ushered in a new global struggle over the sources of authority. This problem is made worse by the rise of American unipolarity. Only the U.S. really has power to project around the world, to systematically engage in large-scale uses of force around the world. The UN has no troops, no military capacity. So the problem of establishing legitimate international authority grows. It becomes a crisis. I call this the Westphalian flip. This is one of my key ideas in the new book, and I'm very excited about it. And since I've got a captive audience, let me just tell you about it. The Westphalian flip. I know it sounds like an Olympic diving routine, but for 500 years, the global system has been built on a distribution and equilibrium of power among major states. Diffusion, equilibrium of power, multiple great powers, always through history. They've tended to be the same ones for many hundreds of years. France, Prussia, Germany, Britain, Russia, China, Japan, US. That kind of equilibrium of power has been the kind of source of one source of order, of Westphalian order, for 500 years. And the other source is hard states, Weberian states, states that have a monopoly on the use of force inside of their territory. And in the last generation or two, we've seen a flipping of that Westphalian order, where the US now has a quasi-monopoly on the use of force internationally, and state sovereignty has eroded, as I've suggested. And this is the little analogy that I come up with for the Westphalian flip. It's like a town that for 500 years had multiple police districts, multiple security forces in different neighborhoods, overnight becoming a town where you have one sheriff and no locks on the doors. And that sheriff says, I will protect everybody, I'll determine where the threats are, I'll go in, I can arrest people before they've committed a crime. There was a movie, Minority Report, Tom Cruise, where it's a sci-fi movie where he was able to draw on this technology to know when a crime was going to be committed before it was. And he and his emergency forces would go in and swoop down and arrest somebody before he shot somebody, robbed a bank, or something like that. So kind of preemptive use. So the U.S. is in a position where it is the sheriff and there are no locks on the doors. There's no town council that decides when that sheriff should behave, how it should behave. So if you are a townsperson, you're going to be saying, regardless of the reputation of that sheriff, is this good or bad? On the one hand, I don't have to pay for security. Sheriff is going to do it. It's efficient. We don't have balancing. But how is that sheriff going to act? Is he going to be like, Mayberry RFD, Barney Fife, and kind of the friendly policeman who's public-spirited, or is it going to be like LAPD? Is it going to be more of a police force that uses its power, abuses its power occasionally, and it doesn't necessarily fully play by rules? So the question is, how is that order stable? Unipolarity, eroded sovereignty has created this kind of crisis of authority regarding the United States. I would make one other point. Everybody knows this. I was in Japan 3 weeks ago and for a conference, and I got an interesting call from someone who said, would you like to have dinner with former Prime Minister Koizumi at the Mandarin Oriental on a Friday night after you arrive? I said, okay. And what's for dinner? And I took the Princeton Project report, and I was told, why don't you start by talking about the Princeton Project, and there'll be an interpreter, and you talk a little bit, then he'll interpret, and so what was interesting is that after I talked a bit, Koizumi got interested in what I was saying about the United Nations, about American power, some of the things I've said tonight, and he said, America has power, but the UN has legitimacy. And he went on to say it was like in Japanese history, the samurai and the shogun era, where the shoguns had power, but the emperor had legitimacy. So no matter how much power and hard power those shoguns had, they always knew that they needed to get the blessing of the emperor. And in some sense, the UN plays that role. The United States can't legitimate itself on its own. And this problem is exacerbated, as I said. Finally, the privatization of war. By the way, it was great. I said one thing to Koizumi that he's noted for being very bored unless you can stimulate in some way. And he'll talk in a whisper, and then if he's really excited, he'll like, so you can kind of know if you've hit a button, because otherwise he's kind of sleeping with his head on the table. And his head was up the whole time. And at one point I said, Mr. Prime Minister, pass the sugar. No, I said, one of the problems we have in the United States is when we think about Japan, we think of you as having a problem with China and the history issue that's unresolved. And this kind of shook him up a little bit. He said, and then he launched into a half-hour discussion of why he went to Yasukuni. And it was quite interesting. And so anyway, in some sense, he knows that to a certain degree, Japan itself has a legitimacy problem. But we can come back to Japan if we want to. I would just simply say that these underlying problems have created an issue of authority for the United States. Final issue, privatization of war. This is something that is changing the international landscape in interesting ways. Violence is manifest in new ways. Small groups of people, in ways previously impossible, are in a position where they can wield destructive force across borders in unpredictable ways. Informal violence, privatization of war. It used to be in the old days we were worried about powerful states marching across borders. That's what the UN was all about, to prevent that from happening again. Now we have these terrorist networks that potentially could get access to weapons of mass destruction and lay waste to whole cities, kill millions. And this is what is creating a new security environment in which the world is reacting, and in some sense America itself has the power and some ideas, but not yet the ability to bring countries together to really tackle this problem. But the problem itself is deeply rooted in technology, and it plays havoc to ideas about deterrence, Article 51 of the United Nations of self-defense, and state sovereignty and security. So in the background, that is creating the problem again. Let me now end by saying something about the future. I've tried to make the argument that there's a crisis. I've tried to make the argument that it's deeply rooted in a variety of factors that are combining. There are other factors as well I could mention, but those are the big ones. What can be done? The kind of Lenin's question. Can a reluctant America be made to be more multilateral and to kind of reassert its leadership? Can it find a kind of inspiration to step forward as it did in the 1940s? I would suggest 4 ways in which the United States might be able to move forward, and some of these ideas are in the Princeton Project report. The first one is to rebuild alliances, particularly NATO. This is the most successful alliance in history. It's connected the United States to the other Western powers. It's provided a mechanism, as I suggested, for stable relationship among the major democracies. And it has a basic bargain attached to it that I suggested earlier, where the United States will provide security and provide troops in Europe, and it will open itself up to the voices of Europeans. So Europeans will get, in effect, some seat at the table of the American unipolar state. In return, the United States will get, hopefully, the legitimacy that comes from European support of American policy. NATO, if this bargain were reestablished, could be used more effectively around the world. Already, NATO is in Afghanistan, but it could be used in other ways outside of Europe to be a kind of mechanism, a legitimate mechanism where these major democracies use force and provide a kind of joint security enterprise around the world. So NATO. Second proposal, build a concert of democracies. Build an organization that's new, that's more global than NATO, but more selective than the UN, based on democracy. We've got this idea in the Princeton Project report. One thing we know as scholars, and that is that countries like the United States are more willing to make commitments and partnerships with other democracies that share values with the United States. Likewise, it works the other direction as well. So we want to find ways to leverage this democracy impulse of cooperation that comes with being democracies. So a concert of democracies that would include NATO, the US countries, North American countries, but also East Asian countries, Korea, Japan, hopefully some of the Southeast Asian countries, India, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, countries that have been, who are now democracies, in wonderful stories about the rise of democracy in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and bring them into the core of the governance system, make them partners in new ways. Can we find a way to get India inside of this order? So democracy, alliance or concert of democracies. And that democracy coalition could be used to push for reform of the UN. I won't go into this, but our proposal is for radically expanding the size of the UN Security Council, add countries like Germany and Japan, and Koizumi loved that idea, but also India, Brazil, Mexico, 2 African states, including South Africa, and hopefully 1 Muslim state, and do away with the veto. And so the United States would have to give up some of its P5 veto right, but in return it would get countries that would be in the system, in the Security Council, most of them democracies, really only Russia and China as outside, hopefully coming towards democracy. But the concert of democracies as a kind of vehicle for renewing these institutions that I've said are so weak. Thirdly, work informally through networks. Lots of ways in which the U.S. can cooperate with other countries without big formal institutions. And I'll just leave it at that. Finally, and this is my last point, one of the things that's so striking about the 1940s is this confluence of realism and liberalism. It's a public intellectual vision that we no longer have. And let me just say a word about this. I just read the new biography of Dean Acheson. And it tells the really interesting story of Acheson's partnership with Truman and how the two of them really did these heroic things. during the mid-1940s into the 50s. The Truman Doctrine, aiding Greece and Turkey, and putting the United States in a position to step forward to support struggling groups struggling for freedom. The Marshall Plan that put Europe on its feet. NATO that brought the countries together in ways I suggested. All of that was really made possible by a few people in Washington in the 1940s, including Dean Acheson and Truman. And it was a remarkable set of ideas in their heads. It wasn't all kind of realism like Henry Kissinger, where it's a kind of an amoral policy of power balancing. There was an idealism, what I would call a liberal internationalism idea that was connected to this and melded with realism. It wasn't simply idealism. Acheson was a terribly realist, pragmatic, practical man. He was a lawyer. He was not somebody to have great dreams, but for example, the UN, he thought it was necessary for legitimacy, but he didn't think it could bring peace on earth. He said, like he said in a speech in, I think, 1948, the UN, is a little bit, he said, I think about the UN, I think about the old Arab proverb, you can drag, an ass to Mecca, but it's still an ass. That you can take countries, put them in the UN, and they still aren't going to behave very well if they don't behave very well outside of it. So he's a realist. He's skeptical of these big things, but he partnered with Truman, Harry Truman, this accidental president who for 45 years carried around in his wallet a little poem by Wadsworth, Lockersby Hall, which is an ode to the universal grandeur of humanity, that we're all in it together. You could read it and you sort of think of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It was that kind of vision of one people, and he was a champion of the UN. He was Roosevelt, FDR's point person in the UN before Roosevelt died. He had been a Wilsonian enthusiast when he was a politician before, but he was also sobered by what happened with Wilson and of course sobered by the Soviet Union after World War II. But in a strange way, the two of them brought together these and were bespoke this kind of confluence of realism and liberalism. And it was that public vision which allowed the United States to do these extraordinary things. From 1944 to 52, engaging in the most hyperactive institution building, order building exercise the world has ever seen. Most of those institutions, weakened today, are still with us today. And what's missing today is that vision, that intellectual software. We talk about institutions today, and you're worried about being branded a utopian pacifist or something like that. Or the kind of politics of the day makes it more difficult for politicians to say America's interests are served by sponsoring and operating within a set of rules. So that is the ultimate, I think, recipe for rebuilding our world and putting the United States back at the center of it and at the center of leadership in a new era where the threats are much more diffuse and shifting and uncertain. But if we are to meet them with our partners, we're going to need partners, and we're going to need a vision that will get us to a new rebuilt cooperative system. And so with that, I'll stop. I'll take any questions you have, but thank you for your attention. Thank you. Sure. I'll take any questions. The easiest ones first, please.
How much does the future that you see for the United States and the world depend on American power? In other words, if over a 10-year period we withdrew from the world with spaces, took home the soldiers, from Korea and Iraq and so on, would you still be able to have would soft power be enough?
No. U.S. role in the world is terribly important, particularly in Asia, Greater Asia. In Europe, it's still important in slightly different ways. It's not important. The defense of Europe is not so much an issue today. But in Asia, example, and we call them in our field security dilemmas, when countries feel insecure and defend themselves by acquiring new weapons, and that makes other countries more insecure, so they acquire weapons, and then the first country gets insecure even more, and it's back. It's a vicious circle, a security dilemma. The U.S. role in Asia prevents security dilemmas from breaking out. The U.S. Protection of Japan means that Japan doesn't have to worry about acquiring nuclear weapons that would just make China go berserk. And Korea too, by the way. Korea is very suspicious of Japan. So the U.S. plays a role, and even China. I go to China, and I go to Asia a lot, and China occasionally, and Chinese will say that, in some ways the U.S.-Japan alliance, while publicly there's a sense that maybe it's going to be used against us in the Taiwan Straits, but in a larger sense, it keeps Japan from having to develop a more traditional military capacity that would make China less secure. So even China quietly sees the alliance as good as long as it doesn't get too global. And this is what I tried to tell Koizumi, and if I could have dinner with George Bush, I'd tell him the same thing, that don't go crazy with it. Don't make it a kind of mechanism for ruling the world. Let the alliance stay kind of delimited so that it's now a source of stability in the region. If it becomes this kind of tool to travel around the world fighting terrorism, it becomes more provocative and it loses this functional role it has. So the U.S. I think is terribly important. I'm a kind of liberal Reaganaut in the sense that I think America's power in the world is generally a force for good, but it plays that role when it's enlightened, it's tied into institutions, which puts some constraints on the U.S. exercise of power, but in the long run it makes us better. It makes our power more legitimate, and our authority establishes authority. So hard power is terribly important. I think the world, in the right configuration of American external actions, the world is not against it, really, except for the most extreme parties in various parts of the world. There is a hunger for a kind of American leadership that is of a certain sort, and I've tried to suggest some of that by looking at the past. So I think I can't imagine a stable order where the U.S. Pulls back and becomes protectionist and nationalist. I hope that Iraq doesn't turn us into that kind of country. I don't think it will. So anyway, that's what I think.
Seems to me that one of the problems in the U.S. is that nobody really knows what rights belong to the citizens. And are we really allowed to use so much of the oil and natural resources, so much of the power that accumulates? Or is this something that other nations will always be suspicious of? And what would other nations' citizens be entitled to? And how does anyone decide?
Well, that's a great question, and it's yet another kind of deep problem that aggravates all the problems I've talked about. It's resource scarcity and the growing competition for oil. The U.S. uses a great deal. China's using more and more all the time. There's going to be a scramble for it. There's clearly a suspicion. People think the U.S. intervened in Iraq because of oil, and the U.S. finds its interests in the region. It can't really get out of the region because of oil in some ways, among other things. So it's a huge issue, and people, I have lots of friends who are experts in it, and they could give you a better answer if they were here, but I would just say that, I have my problems with Tom Friedman, but who I actually may see in Washington tomorrow, so I should say something good about him. I think that he's right on that one of the things that would be the smartest national security thing we could do is really sort of put ourselves to work at trying to reduce dependence on oil, and in the form of technology innovation for all sorts of things that use oil, including automobiles. We're going to spend $500 billion on the Iraq War. What if we could have used that to innovate and make a kind of leap forward in transportation technologies and alternative energies? So I think if this is a war we're in, we should really do what we did in the last war. We had a Manhattan Project, and we were willing to spend money on, like, such as the Marshall Plan, which transferred several percentage of American wealth to Europe. So, I think there's a lot there, and I wish that politicians would see that it's a really hot issue that they could use. I don't think it's, if you talk about technology innovation more than taxes, you can probably make it more of a palatable kind of political issue. So, sir.
Yes. What you've spoken about is sort of outward-looking from the United States out to the world, basically, and its use of its power and how it relates to the rest of the world. I'd like to ask you to look inward for a moment, because I think we've just gone through a period of like 25 years where any notion of internationalism is sort of demeaned and has cost the Democrats elections repeatedly. And what are the chances of sort of approaching international affairs in the way that you sort of stated politically, internally?
Well, this Princeton Project report, we're going to take out to town hall meetings. We hope to do one in Iowa with Representative Leach, who's actually out of business now. But terrific person, Republican. Hagel in Nebraska, we hope. Maybe Obama in Illinois and elsewhere. So, we're committed to having this discussion about American interests and making the argument very much that internationalism, updated internationalism, is very much in the American interest and, by the way, in the global interest. There's a big debate among scholars about this. I'm in pretty tough knockout, drag-out intellectual battles with various scholars around the country on this issue. I tend to see there hasn't been a deep fundamental change. Politically, among elites, there has been. Interestingly, there's polling that makes my point. 60%, as many Americans as Europeans as a percent of the population, think that their country, in this case our country, should work through the United Nations, for example. There's strong support. It hasn't declined since the end of the Cold War. It's actually gone up since the Iraq War. That tells you that we're kind of learning a little bit. Maybe we should do things differently next time. There's interesting polling about what words resonate with the American public, and in terms like international cooperation, with these various focus groups, they turn their buttons up on those, so there's internationalism, I think, is really still alive and well. What some polling suggests is that politicians in Washington think their constituents are more anti-internationalist than in fact they are. If you're in Washington, you don't think you can kind of go to your constituency and say we should be doing X, Y, and Z. So I think there's room there for leadership of a certain sort. Again, the kind of Truman-Atchison, it was a kind of tough internationalism. It wasn't seen as being soft. And you saw this with Bush and Kerry. Kerry was not a great candidate in many ways. We've seen that over and over again, I guess. But substantively, he was making an argument about how it would be in America's interest to get the UN to buy onto American use of force options because it would leverage American power. It's a force multiplier. And the other side was saying, well, I don't think we should ask the international community for a permission slip. And that had more political traction. What I'm suggesting is that if you talk about force multipliers, it's the unilateralists, it's the John Boltons of the world who are the weak, who are thinking about America in the kind of narrow sense of power and sovereignty, and they're missing the ability to make American power really leverage it and make it more plenary and more effective. So I think in the long run, the ideas have to be right. If the idea is right that I've made, that America is safer it can accomplish more things it wants to accomplish by doing X, Y, and Z rather than A, B, and C. If that is true, then in the long run, that kind of policy will be rewarded and the other kind of policy will be penalized. So I'm optimistic that if I'm right, the United States will in fact respond to those incentives in the long run and will learn lessons. So, and but it's conceivable I'm wrong, but if I'm right, I think that politics does in some sense in the long run follow kind of rational incentives. And so that leads me to be moderately optimistic.
Wondering to what extent does the effect of unipolarity depend on the perception in the rest of the world of American power, and how is that affected by what's happened in Iraq and the privatization of military, which seems to, even though we may have by far the biggest military, which seems to indicate limitations on the
Right. The old Hobbes, the various theorists of power, reputation for power is more important than power, and the American power is probably at its zenith before it exercised it, and therefore the limits were exposed. And so I think, it's certainly the U.S. Options on Iran, options on use of force for humanitarian purposes. Darfur, the U.S. It seems less powerful, and the world sees that and may be taking advantage of it. Some of the countries around the world that don't wish America well think that Iraq was a great sort of event because it has kind of put America back down, tied America down. China, the Chinese. Say, yes, the United States, oh, yes, you need to pay attention to Iraq. Stay there. We'll take care of Asia. Iraq, very important. War on terrorism, Central Front. Chinese saying, yeah, that's good. We'll, come back when, you're done. We'll be here. So, yeah, I think opportunity costs are great, and reputation for power has shifted. Again, I don't think it's irreversible. I think that the deep advantages the United States has are still there. So I think that a lot of this could come back, but perceptions matter. Is that one more? And then, okay, one more. Better be good.
One of the problems may be that on paper we have power, but we don't have the discipline. For instance, an American general to be successful has to lose 0 people and also kill 0 of the enemy. So because of the reporting of the media and various other sources, we've gotten to a position where we may be expecting impossible things from ourselves.
Right. Well, that's a good point. I mean, there's no question that the U.S. There's been a change over the decades in the American view about the use of force. America will support it if it's, I think if the objectives are clear, if there's a kind of, if it's easily achievable, doesn't take too long, and if the casualties are not that high. So, it does mean that you've got to be careful. You've got to husband your power and your support at home. And if you lose it, then the options for dealing with other crises. I mean, it's both true about reputation for power, but American troops have been shuttled back into Iraq and out of Europe and Asia, and I'm not sure those troops will ever go back. And that is having a cost on these alliances that I've spent a fair amount of time this evening talking about them and their importance. The U.S.-Korean alliance is in crisis. And it's partly in crisis because we're moving troops out of there. We've got this kind of flexible vision about we'll put them here, we'll put them there, but the underlying bilateral relationship is suffering from that. So, lots of these problems are interconnected, and so I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much for a great question.